I never thought this would be my story. Life had a rhythm, a predictability, and I found solace in that. My wife, Emma, and I had been married for 8 years. We shared a beautiful home and memories that felt like the foundation of something unshakable. My stepfather, Paul, was a significant part of our lives too. He was there when my mom passed away, a calm but supportive presence during the chaos of grief. I didn't grow up with Paul. He entered my life during my late teens, but over the years, I came to respect him. He was polished, charming, and always seemed to know how to smooth over life's rough edges. Perhaps I should have seen him for what he truly was, but hindsight always feels like a cruel joke. Emma and I had a routine. On Friday nights, we'd cook dinner together, laugh about our week, and sometimes dream aloud about vacations we'd take when life slowed down. This particular Friday, though, the energy felt different. Emma was quieter, distracted. I asked her if something was wrong, but she brushed it off, saying work had been stressful. I didn't push. It wasn't unusual for her to need space. But later that night, as I lay in bed, her phone buzzed with a message. Emma rarely left her phone on silent. When I glanced at the screen, the name on the notification froze me in place. Paul. Curiosity isn't always innocent, and I felt a pang of guilt as I unlocked her phone. The conversation was cryptic, jokes about their last time, and an insinuation about meeting again soon. My heart raced as pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized existed started to form. I put the phone down and told myself I must be misreading it. Surely there was an explanation, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The next morning, I tried to bring it up casually. I asked Emma if she and Paul had been in touch recently. She didn't hesitate when she said no. The lie was so smooth it might have worked, if not for the evidence I already had. I didn't confront her, not then. I needed to be sure. My brain reeled with scenarios, some logical, others absurd. Was I paranoid? Or was my wife, the woman I'd built my life around, betraying me with the man who had promised my mother to look out for me? The doubt gnawed at me until I couldn't hold it in anymore. Later that evening, I called Paul. The conversation was strained, and when I casually mentioned Emma, there was the slightest hesitation in his voice, a crack in the armor of his usual confidence. I knew I had to dig deeper. I decided to start with Emma's phone. A few weeks ago, I'd noticed she was careful with it, always keeping it face down or taking it with her everywhere. That night, while she showered, I accessed it again. This time, I found a hidden folder of messages. And there it was, confirmation. Explicit conversations between her and Paul, filled with details of their rendezvous and references to how they were careful not to let me find out. The betrayal hit like a thunderclap. My stepfather, the man I had trusted with my family, was the person my wife was sneaking away to see. But I didn't confront her right away. Revenge wasn't just about anger. It had to be calculated. If they thought they could outsmart me, I'd let them think so. I'd play the long game, ensuring that when the truth unraveled, it would leave nothing of their lives intact. And so, the first piece of my plan fell into place. I spent the next few days in a haze of silent rage. My mind churned with anger, disbelief, and an aching sense of betrayal. How could they? Emma, the woman I'd trusted with my heart, my home, my future. Paul, the man I'd once turned to for advice, who had promised to step into my father's role after my mother passed. Together, they had taken something sacred and twisted it into a grotesque mockery of loyalty and love. But I didn't confront them. Not yet. Confrontation was impulsive, messy, and fleeting. I needed precision, clarity, and control. If this betrayal had taught me anything, it was to recognize when to bide my time. They'd made their moves, and now it was my turn. The first step was understanding the scope of their deceit. I started paying closer attention to Emma's habits. She'd recently developed a penchant for self-care weekends at the spa, afternoons spent catching up with an old friend, or late-night work events. I pretended to be none the wiser, playing the role of the oblivious husband while quietly documenting her movements. Paul wasn't as accessible, but I knew his routines well. He and I had shared countless beers over football games, conversations about life, and even rounds of golf. He'd always been calculated, a man who prided himself on being 10 steps ahead in business and relationships. But arrogance breeds blindness, and I was counting on that flaw. I installed a tracking app on Emma's phone, cloaked under the guise of a shared calendar app we used for household chores. It was simple, unobtrusive, and gave me real-time updates on her location. With Paul, I took a more analog approach. I knew his favorite haunts and habits and began casually dropping by places I suspected he might frequent. What I found in those first few days sickened me. Emma had met Paul twice during what she claimed were work meetings. One encounter, at a boutique hotel on the edge of town, confirmed the worst. I waited outside in my car, watching her leave the building, her demeanor giddy and carefree. Minutes later, Paul followed, his posture relaxed and self-assured. Their audacity was staggering. That night, Emma came home late, smelling faintly of his cologne. My stomach churned, but I held my composure, greeting her with a kiss on the cheek and asking about her meeting. She wove a story so smooth, so perfectly rehearsed, that it was almost believable. Almost. I slept beside her that night, staring at the ceiling as she lay curled on her side, oblivious to the storm brewing in my mind. Each lie she told, every touch she gave, felt like a dagger in my chest. But I couldn't let anger rule me. Anger was temporary. What I needed was enduring. The next morning, I met with a lawyer. I explained my situation without sparing a single detail, ensuring the groundwork was laid for what was to come. If I was going to dismantle their lives, I needed to ensure that every move was legal, calculated, and devastating. The betrayal wasn't just an attack on my marriage. It was an attack on my dignity, my trust, and my peace. I would rebuild those things. But first, I would make sure they never forgot what they'd done. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice. The facade of my life remained intact, but cracks had started to form, ones that only I could see. To Emma, I was the same doting husband, albeit perhaps a bit quieter, which she likely chalked up to stress from work. To Paul, I was the unwitting stepson, oblivious to the knife he'd lodged in my back. But inside, I was a storm, my anger tempered only by my need to see this through. Emma's lies continued, but now I paid closer attention to her details. She began tripping over her own stories. One Friday evening, she claimed she'd be home late because of a last-minute team dinner. I casually asked where they were eating, and she hesitated, glancing at her phone. "Oh, Carmichael's downtown," she said, flashing a practiced smile. It was a lie. Carmichael's was an upscale restaurant where we used to celebrate anniversaries, a place she knew I had fond memories of. The fact that she invoked it made me sick. I spent the evening tracking her location from the app, watching as her team dinner took her to Paul's townhouse instead. It felt surreal, watching the dots on the screen converge, knowing exactly what was happening behind those closed doors. I clenched my fists, fighting the impulse to drive there and expose them on the spot. Instead, I stayed home, planning. The following day, I met with a private investigator. His name was Marcus, a no-nonsense professional with a reputation for discretion. I handed over the information I'd gathered so far, locations, dates, and screenshots of incriminating texts I'd pulled from Emma's phone. He didn't ask many questions, only nodding as he jotted down notes. "You want proof," he said, his voice calm and businesslike. "Concrete, undeniable proof. I'll get it for you." I left the meeting feeling a grim satisfaction. With Marcus on the case, I could focus on the next phase of my plan. Paul was harder to track than Emma, but his arrogance left trails. He liked to flaunt his wealth and influence, hosting elaborate dinners and networking events. He even had the gall to invite me to a cocktail party he was throwing for his business partners. I attended, playing the part of the loyal stepson. The evening was a blur of polite conversations and fake laughter. Paul worked the room like a seasoned politician, his charm effortless and nauseating. At one point, he pulled me aside, clapping a hand on my shoulder. "How's everything with you and Emma? You two still thinking about that trip to Italy?" I forced a smile, still saving up for it. "Good man," he said, smirking. "Take care of her. She's one of a kind." The audacity of his words made my blood boil, but I kept my expression neutral. Inside, I was counting the days until I could watch his perfect little world collapse. This wasn't just about Emma anymore. Paul had betrayed my mother's memory, violated the trust she'd placed in him. He had to pay, and I would make sure the cost was steep. By the time the evening ended, Marcus had sent me an update. Photos of Emma and Paul entering a hotel together earlier that day. The proof was stacking up. Their web of lies was unraveling, and I was holding the threads. It was only a matter of time. The pieces of my plan were falling into place, but I had to keep playing the role of the unsuspecting husband. Every morning, I kissed Emma goodbye, hiding my contempt behind a mask of routine affection. Every time I spoke with Paul, I acted as though his advice still held value, suppressing the urge to confront him with the evidence I now had. The rage inside me was a fire, but I had learned to control it, to use it as fuel. The first step of my trap involved exposing their affair in a way they couldn't deny. Confronting them directly would give them the chance to spin the narrative, to claim misunderstandings or, worse, blame me for the collapse of our marriage. No, this had to be indisputable. Marcus, my private investigator, had outdone himself. Over the next few weeks, he provided a treasure trove of damning evidence. High-definition photos of Paul and Emma entering hotels together, timestamps confirming their clandestine meetings, and even video footage of a particularly brazen tryst in Paul's office late one evening. Each piece of evidence was cataloged and cross-referenced, creating a timeline of their betrayal that would be impossible to refute. The next step was legal. I met with my lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Victoria. When I laid the evidence on her desk, her expression didn't flinch. "This is enough to bury them," she said, flipping through the photos and transcripts. "Do you want to pursue a divorce immediately, or do you have something else in mind?" "I have plans," I replied. "I'll file for divorce, but not yet. I need time to set things in motion." Victoria nodded, understanding the subtext. She began drafting a strategy that would ensure I retained the upper hand, both financially and socially. I turned my focus to Paul's life. While Emma's betrayal cut deep, it was Paul who had ignited something far darker in me. He had built his reputation as a trustworthy businessman, a family man, and a pillar of the community. To see that image shattered, to watch him fall from grace, would be the revenge I needed. Through Marcus's research, I learned that Paul's business wasn't as solid as he liked to project. He was heavily leveraged, using risky investments to keep his empire afloat. One bad deal could send it all tumbling down. I began anonymously feeding information to his competitors, highlighting weak points in his portfolio and sowing seeds of doubt among his investors. At home, I laid the groundwork for my final play with Emma. I was attentive and kind, even suggesting we take a weekend getaway to reconnect. She seemed surprised by my sudden warmth, but didn't question it. If anything, she seemed relieved, as though my ignorance was an escape from her guilt. The weekend came, and we drove to a secluded cabin upstate. The isolation gave me the perfect opportunity to confront her, but not yet. I wanted her to relax, to believe she was safe. That night, as she slept beside me, I scrolled through the folder of evidence on my phone. The weight of what I was about to do settled over me, but I felt no hesitation. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice, served cold and calculated. By the time we returned home, Emma would have no idea her world was about to implode. Neither would Paul. The weekend getaway was serene, almost idyllic, an irony that wasn't lost on me. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, surrounded by towering trees and the hum of nature. Emma seemed lighter, more at ease, as though she believed we were healing, moving past whatever unspoken tension had crept between us. I played along, smiling during our hikes and cooking meals for her by the fireplace. But beneath the surface, my mind was a storm. Every laugh she gave felt like a dagger, every glance a reminder of the lies she told so effortlessly. Still, I held my mask in place. I needed her to believe everything was fine. The final night at the cabin, after dinner, we sat by the fire. Emma sipped wine, her gaze soft in the flickering light. "I feel like we're turning a corner," she said suddenly, her voice hesitant but hopeful. "It's nice, isn't it? Just us." I nodded, swallowing the bitterness that rose in my throat. "It is." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with unspoken truths I wasn't ready to voice. Not yet. Instead, I let her fall asleep that night thinking everything was perfect. The morning we left the cabin, I was quiet, lost in thought. On the drive back, I casually asked her about her week ahead. She listed off mundane plans, a meeting at work, coffee with a friend, and of course, another team dinner. I knew better now. The lies rolled off her tongue so easily. I almost admired the skill it took to craft them. Almost. When we arrived home, she kissed me goodbye and headed to the grocery store. I watched her car pull out of the driveway, my heart pounding as I moved to the next phase of my plan. I walked into our home office, locked the door, and opened my laptop. Marcus had delivered everything I needed, and now it was time to deploy it. Using an anonymous email address, I attached the evidence, photos, videos, timestamps, and sent it to a carefully selected list of recipients. Paul's investors, his board of directors, and key members of the community he so desperately sought to impress. Next, I sent a similar package to Emma's employer. While her actions might not directly affect her work, the company's moral clause left little room for discretion. Her perfect professional image wouldn't survive the revelations I'd unleashed. The final email went to Paul himself. No words, no explanations, just a subject line that read, "I know everything," followed by the incriminating evidence. With the email sent, I waited. It didn't take long. Paul called first. I let it ring, watching his name flash on the screen with grim satisfaction. He left a voicemail, his voice frantic as he begged me to meet and talk. Then came Emma. She returned home, her face pale, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling. I looked up from the couch, feigning confusion. "What's wrong?" She hesitated, her eyes darting to her phone. Did you send something to Paul?" I stood slowly, letting the weight of the moment settle between us. "Why would I do that?" I asked, my tone calm, almost amused. Emma's lips parted as though to answer, but no words came. She was unraveling, the mask she'd worn for so long cracking under the weight of her lies. The trap had been sprung, and now, there was no escape. Emma's face was pale, her composure slipping with every second that passed. The silence between us stretched taut, filled with the weight of everything she'd done and everything I now knew. "Why are you acting like this?" she finally stammered, clutching her phone like a lifeline. I don't understand what's going on." I tilted my head, watching her squirm. "Don't you?" Her eyes widened, and the faintest tremor passed over her lips. I could see her calculating, trying to piece together how much I knew. I let her flounder, the tension in the room building until it was unbearable. "I think it's time for you to stop lying, Emma," I said, my voice cold but calm. "I know about Paul. I know about the hotels, the late-night meetings, the plans you've been making behind my back." Her gasp was sharp, involuntary, as though I'd struck her. "I don't. What are you talking about?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Don't insult me," I snapped, letting the anger creep into my tone. "I've been patient, Emma. I gave you every opportunity to come clean, to stop this before it got worse. But you chose to keep lying. You chose him." Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't afford to feel pity now, not after what I'd discovered. This isn't fair," she said, her voice breaking. "You don't understand." "What's to understand?" I interrupted, stepping closer. "That you betrayed me with the one person you knew would hurt me most? That you sat across from me at dinner, slept beside me at night, and lied to my face without a second thought? Tell me, Emma, what don't I understand?" She crumbled then, sinking onto the couch as sobs racked her body. "It wasn't supposed to be like this," she choked out. "I didn't mean for it to happen." Her words felt hollow, meaningless. "And yet, here we are," I said, stepping back to create distance between us. "Paul's life is about to fall apart, Emma. His investors, his colleagues, they all know. I made sure of it." Her head shot up, panic replacing her tears. What did you do?" "I showed them the truth," I replied evenly. "The truth about who he is and what he's been doing. You might want to check your phone next because I imagine it won't be long before your boss finds out too." She stared at me, horror dawning on her face as the reality of my words sank in. "You're ruining everything," she said, her voice rising. "You're ruining my life." I laughed bitterly. "Ruining your life? No, Emma. You did that all on your own. I'm just making sure you can't hurt me or anyone else again." As she sat there, shaking, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She grabbed it with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the screen before a sob escaped her lips. I didn't need to see the message to know what it said. The fallout had begun, and this was only the beginning. I walked past her, heading for the door. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer," I said over my shoulder. "This marriage is over, Emma, and so is the life you thought you could keep living." Her cries followed me as I left the room, but I didn't look back. There was nothing left to say. The fallout began to spread like wildfire. Within hours of my emails, the carefully constructed lives of both Emma and Paul began to disintegrate. Paul called me repeatedly, his voice growing more desperate with every voicemail. The bravado, the charm, it was gone. Instead, he sounded panicked, as if he finally understood the gravity of what was happening. "Look, I don't know what you think you've done," he said in one message, his words stumbling over each other. "But we can fix this. Just call me back, okay? We're family." Family. The word tasted bitter on my tongue. Family didn't do what he'd done. By the end of the day, Marcus sent me an update. Several of Paul's investors had pulled their funding, citing moral concerns and trust issues. His company was already struggling, and this blow was enough to send it spiraling. A board meeting had been called, and Paul's position as CEO was on the chopping block. I allowed myself a moment of satisfaction, but reminded myself that this wasn't over. That evening, I received another voicemail, but this one wasn't from Paul. It was from his wife. Yes, I thought grimly. His wife deserves to know, too. Her voice was cold, controlled. "I know what you sent. Thank you for confirming what I already suspected. I've spoken to my lawyer." She didn't need to say more. Paul wasn't just losing his career. He was about to lose his marriage, his home, and the respect he so desperately craved. Later that night, as I sat in the quiet of my now chaotic home, I received another update from Marcus. This time, it was about Emma. Her employer had called her in for a meeting that afternoon. They confronted her with the evidence I'd sent, proof of her moral failings, which directly violated the company's code of conduct. Emma had tried to argue, plead even, but it was no use. They terminated her on the spot. The news didn't surprise me, but what Marcus told me next did. "She called Paul after she was fired," he said. The call was short, but from what I could gather, she accused him of ruining her life. A bitter smile tugged at my lips. Even now, they were already turning on each other. But that wasn't the highlight of Marcus's update. "She also contacted her parents," he added. "Apparently, she's asking for a place to stay." Her parents, traditional, reserved, and deeply religious, had always admired me. They trusted me to take care of their daughter. I could only imagine the conversations happening now. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the day's events pressing down on me. For years, I had built my life around these people, Emma and Paul. I trusted them, loved them, believed in them, and in return, they betrayed me. Now, their lies were unraveling, their carefully curated facades shattering. This was only the start. Emma had lost her job, Paul was losing his company, and both of them were about to lose everything they thought they could hold on to. As I stared out the window, the night stretching dark and endless before me, I let myself breathe deeply for the first time in weeks. The house was silent now, but it wasn't oppressive. It was peaceful. For the first time in years, I felt like I was in control. Emma moved out 2 days after the confrontation. She packed her things in silence, avoiding my gaze as I stood in the doorway, watching her dismantle the life we had built together. The woman who had once filled our home with laughter now left with nothing but shame and the weight of her own choices. "Do you even feel sorry for what you've done?" I asked finally, breaking the heavy silence. Her hands froze on the box she was taping shut. She didn't turn to face me. "I didn't mean for it to get this far," she murmured, her voice thick with something that might have been regret or just exhaustion. "That's not an answer," I said, my tone sharp. She looked up at me then, her eyes red-rimmed but defiant. Yes, okay? I'm sorry. But what does it matter now? You've ruined my life. My job, my reputation, everything. I laughed, low and bitter. Ruined your life? No, Emma. You and Paul ruined your lives. I just made sure everyone saw the truth. She didn't respond, just slammed the box shut and carried it to her car. I watched as she drove away, her taillights disappearing down the street, and felt nothing but relief. Paul, meanwhile, was imploding in spectacular fashion. The board of his company voted unanimously to remove him as CEO. The announcement made headlines, and within hours, his name was trending for all the wrong reasons. Stories leaked of the ethical violations tied to his dismissal. It wasn't just the affair. It was years of backdoor deals and shady practices that I'd subtly brought to light. His wife, Evelyn, wasted no time. She filed for divorce the same day the news broke. Paul was spotted outside their home, trying to plead with her through a locked door while movers carried boxes of his belongings to the curb. Evelyn's statement to the press was concise but scathing. I have no tolerance for deceit, in business or in my personal life. I could only imagine how Paul was handling his fall from grace. The man who had once looked down on everyone from his position of power was now at rock bottom, his empire in ruins and his allies deserting him one by one. My own life, meanwhile, was beginning to shift in unexpected ways. For so long, I had been consumed by the need for revenge, the weight of betrayal suffocating every other thought. But now, with the pieces of my plan falling into place, I felt a strange sense of freedom. I started to focus on myself again. I reconnected with old friends, hit the gym, and even started sketching out plans for a trip, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. The anger that had once consumed me was giving way to something else: clarity. The fallout wasn't over yet. There were still loose ends to tie up, still consequences for Emma and Paul to face. But for the first time in months, I felt the tide turning in my favor. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was rebuilding. And soon, I would thrive. Paul's downfall was accelerating at a pace even I hadn't anticipated. By the end of the week, his business was in freefall. The media had latched onto the scandal with glee, running headline after headline detailing his removal as CEO, the allegations of financial misconduct, and of course, the affair. Evelyn, his now estranged wife, had gone nuclear. Not content with simply divorcing him, she began digging into their shared finances. Marcus, ever the efficient investigator, informed me that she was working with her own team to expose every skeleton in Paul's closet. It was poetic justice. The man who had prided himself on being untouchable was now utterly exposed. Emma wasn't faring much better. Her parents had reluctantly taken her in, but their frosty reception spoke volumes. According to Marcus, they were appalled, not just by the affair, but by the fact that she jeopardized everything we had built for something so reckless. She spends most of her time in her childhood bedroom, Marcus reported during one of our updates. I doubt she's ever felt this cornered in her life. I couldn't muster sympathy for her. She had made her bed. Now she could lie in it. Meanwhile, Paul wasn't just losing his professional empire. His personal life was unraveling just as quickly. I had ensured that the financial records Marcus uncovered made their way to Evelyn's legal team. Bank transfers to private accounts, suspicious expenditures, and outright theft from his own company painted a damning picture. One evening, as I sipped a whiskey in the calm of my newly quiet home, Marcus called. "You're not going to believe this," he began, a rare note of amusement in his usually neutral tone. Paul tried to contact Evelyn to make amends. She had him served with a restraining order instead. I chuckled, the sound surprising even myself. He really thought he could charm his way out of this, didn't he? "Arrogance is a hard habit to break," Marcus replied. Emma attempted to reach out to me a few days later. She called first, 6 times in a row, but I ignored every attempt. Then came the texts. "Please, can we just talk?" one read. "I need to explain." Another followed shortly after. "I know I hurt you, but I can't fix this if you won't let me." Fix it? There was nothing left to fix. Her final text that evening was more desperate. "You've ruined me. Is that what you wanted? I have nothing left." For the first time, I hesitated, not out of pity, but because I realized how thoroughly I dismantled everything she had relied on. Was this enough? I considered her words, replaying her lies in my head. She had taken everything we built and destroyed it for a fleeting thrill. Yes, I thought. It was enough. I deleted her messages without replying and blocked her number. This was the life they had chosen, and now they were living it. For the first time in months, I slept soundly in the weeks that followed. The chaos around Paul and Emma began to reach its natural conclusion. What had started as whispers of scandal had grown into a full-blown reckoning, and both of them were left standing in the rubble of their own choices. Paul's life, once a display of power and wealth, was now unrecognizable. Evelyn's lawyers had worked efficiently, freezing his assets and ensuring that the divorce would leave him with nothing but debts. The media continued to pile on, with exposés about his financial misdeeds and personal failings. The final blow came when his board officially severed all ties with him. Paul wasn't just removed from his position, he was blacklisted. In a world where reputation was currency, Paul's name was now worthless. Marcus informed me that he had moved into a rented condo far outside the city. Gone were the expensive suits, the luxury cars, and the grand persona he'd built over the years. From what I've seen, he spends most of his time drinking, Marcus said during our last update. He's burned every bridge, and no one wants to take his calls. I couldn't bring myself to feel sorry for him. Paul had preyed on my trust, violated the sanctity of my marriage, and tried to position himself as untouchable. Now, the world saw him for what he truly was: a liar, a fraud, and a man broken by his own hubris. Emma's downfall was quieter, but no less devastating. She was still living with her parents, who treated her with thinly veiled disappointment. The relationship between her and her family had always been fragile, and now it seemed irreparable. Her mother, a stern woman who valued loyalty above all else, had reportedly made her feelings clear. "You were given everything, and this is how you repay him? This is how you repay us." Marcus had also mentioned that Emma had been searching for a new job, but with little success. The stain of her dismissal, coupled with the social ripple effects of the affair, made her unemployable in her previous circles. It was strange, hearing about her struggles. There was a time when I would have cared, when the thought of her in pain would have cut me deeply. But now? Now I felt only detachment, like I was hearing the story of someone I used to know, a distant character from another life. As for me, I was moving forward. I wasn't naive enough to think that everything would be fine overnight, but for the first time in months, I felt the stirrings of hope. I poured myself into work, took long walks in the evenings, and began reconnecting with friends I'd neglected during the worst of it all. One evening, as I was sorting through old photos, I came across a picture of Emma and me on our wedding day. We looked happy, carefree. I stared at it for a long time before tearing it in half and tossing it into the trash. Some things aren't worth holding on to. It wasn't revenge that drove me anymore. It was freedom. Life after Emma and Paul's betrayal was like stepping into a cold, quiet house after a storm. The absence of their chaos left a vacuum, one I didn't immediately know how to fill. At first, I felt untethered, unsure of who I was without the identity of a husband or stepson. But that uncertainty quickly became something else, a canvas for reinvention. I started small. My first act of reclaiming my life was practical. I redecorated the house. The furniture that Emma had chosen, the paint colors she'd insisted on, the photos of our life together, they were all stripped away. I repainted the walls a calming shade of blue, replaced the heavy drapes with ones that let in more light, and hung art that resonated with me. The physical transformation mirrored the internal one I was undergoing. I started therapy, which felt uncomfortable at first, like peeling back layers of myself I'd ignored for years. My therapist, a calm and insightful woman named Dr. Price, challenged me to explore not just my anger at Emma and Paul, but the parts of me that had ignored warning signs, that had clung to a relationship long past its expiration date. "You can acknowledge their betrayal without ignoring your role in what happened," she said one session. "This isn't about blame. It's about understanding." I wasn't ready to forgive Emma or Paul, but I was starting to forgive myself. Work became another source of renewal. My career had always been stable, but now I threw myself into it with renewed energy. I took on ambitious projects, collaborated with new teams, and even earned a promotion. Success felt different now. It wasn't about proving myself to anyone but me. As the weeks turned into months, I also began to reconnect with old passions. I signed up for a cooking class, something I'd always wanted to do but never made time for. I joined a local hiking group and discovered the joy of being in nature, of pushing my body and finding peace in the quiet wilderness. One evening, after a particularly satisfying hike, I returned home to find an email from Marcus. "Thought you'd like to know," it read. Attached was a photo of Paul sitting alone in a dive bar, his shoulders slumped, his expensive suit replaced by a wrinkled shirt and jeans. The caption was succinct, rock bottom. I stared at the photo for a long time. It was everything I'd wanted, to see him brought low, stripped of his power and arrogance. But as I closed the email, I realized it didn't bring me the satisfaction I'd imagined. I didn't need Paul to be at rock bottom anymore. I didn't need him to suffer for me to thrive. That realization felt like a door opening, a weight lifting. I was starting to live for myself again. Months after Emma moved out, I received an unexpected text from an old college friend, Rachel. We'd lost touch over the years, but she'd heard about my divorce through mutual acquaintances. "Hey, just wanted to check in," the message read. "I know things must be tough right now. If you ever want to grab coffee, let me know." At first, I hesitated. The idea of socializing felt daunting, like exposing a wound that hadn't fully healed. But something about Rachel's message felt genuine, and I eventually replied. We met at a small cafe one Saturday morning. Rachel hadn't changed much. Her warm smile and sharp wit were exactly as I remembered. The conversation flowed easily, and for the first time in months, I felt the spark of something more than survival. As we parted ways, she smiled and said, "Don't be a stranger, okay?" That night, I found myself smiling as I replayed our conversation in my head. While my life was slowly rebuilding, Paul's continued to disintegrate. Marcus informed me that Paul had reached out to Evelyn, begging her to reconsider the divorce. She didn't. Instead, she finalized the settlement, taking the house, the savings, and everything she could legally claim. Paul attempted a last-ditch effort to rebuild his reputation, scheduling an interview with a local journalist. It was meant to paint him as a man who had made mistakes, but was seeking redemption. The interview aired on a Thursday evening, and I watched it out of curiosity. Paul tried to appear humble, but his words rang hollow. The journalist, clearly unimpressed, asked pointed questions about the affair and his financial misconduct. By the end, Paul looked defeated, his attempt at redemption only further solidifying his disgrace. It was his swan song, and it ended in silence. One day, months after the dust had settled, Emma reached out. She asked if we could meet, just to talk. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a park, sitting on a bench under the late afternoon sun. She looked tired, worn down by the consequences of her actions. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not for what happened to me, but for what I did to you." Her apology was raw, and for the first time, it felt genuine. I listened without interrupting, letting her words hang in the air. "I didn't realize how much I was throwing away until it was too late," she admitted. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for saying that." As I walked away, I felt lighter. I didn't forgive her, not completely, but I no longer carried the weight of her betrayal. A year after everything had happened, I stood on the summit of a mountain, the sun rising over the horizon. Rachel stood beside me, her hand in mine, as we marveled at the view. Life had changed in ways I couldn't have imagined. The man I had been, the husband, the stepson, the betrayed, was gone. In his place was someone stronger, someone who had faced his darkest days and come out the other side. Emma and Paul were distant memories now. Emma had moved out of her parents' house and was trying to rebuild her life. Paul had disappeared entirely, his name now synonymous with failure. As the wind brushed against my face, I closed my eyes and breathed deeply. I wasn't defined by their betrayal anymore. I was free.